Welcome everybody to today's Penn AI Tech webinar. Our webinar series for the Penn Artificial Intelligence and Technology Collaboratory for Healthy Aging is a series sponsored by the National Institute on Aging as is our collaboratory. And we have the opportunity to hear from speakers, national and international speakers who share their expertise with us. And today we're very happy to have with us Dr. Konstantin Aliferis. Dr. Aliferis is at the University of Minnesota, where he holds the position of professor and also director of the Institute for Health Informatics. And he's the first University of Minnesota Chief Research Informatics Officer, heading the Clinical and Translational Institute Biomedical Informatics Program and the Biomedical Informatics Program. His research is focused on high-dimensional modeling and analysis designed to transform biomedical data into novel, actionable scientific knowledge. Throughout his career, he studied and taught the formal and empirical properties of artificial intelligence methods, conducted large empirical benchmarks, analyzed errors and pitfalls in the related literature, designed and evaluated robust protocols and auto-modelers based on best practices. And building on these experiences and the rapidly evolving related literature, he recently completed with Dr. Simon the first book on health AI and machine learning pitfalls and best practices, to be released by Springer Nature. We're very happy to have Dr. Aliferis with us. I want to remind you all that if you have questions for our speaker, you can put them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will get a chance to address those in the Q&A discussion after his presentation. So again, Dr. Aliferis, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you so you can share your screen.
Thank you, Professor Demiris. It's truly a great pleasure for me to join you today. The Penn AI Tech Collaborative for Healthy Aging has been doing amazing work in the space of AI and aging, and I try to tailor this talk to this topic in particular. The nature of this talk spans two areas. One is the best practices for safe and effective AI and machine learning, but also how some of these principles can be applied in aging and longevity research. And let me see here. Yes. So we will cover some foundational concepts and also what are recent trends and developments in the literature and elsewhere, and then motivate the need for AI and machine learning best practices, address where the best practices are coming from, what is the notion of trust in AI and the dimensions of trust. And I will single out some specific parts of this space around overfitting, underfitting, underperforming models, overconfidence in models is one very important foundational area. The second one is the importance of causality in health AI and machine learning, and the importance of modeling equivalence classes. And then I will show some examples of how the above principles are applied in recent aging and longevity science research conducted in my lab and a number of collaborators that I will discuss as we move forward. The primary source for this presentation is the forthcoming book that Professor Demiris mentioned, about pitfalls and best practices in healthcare and the health science, AI, and machine learning, which was co-authored by myself and George Simon. And we also had some great contributing authors for certain more specialized parts of this book. So this is going to be an open access volume. So everybody will have free access to the contents of the electronic version of the volume, thanks to the generous funding provided by the University of Minnesota to make this happen. I also mentioned many articles in the slides and at the end of the slides. So let's address some foundational concepts. So AI is a part of computer science. Computer science has many subdisciplines. AI is a very major subfield of computer science, and machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence. And within AI, there are many different areas than machine learning. And within machine learning, there are many, many different techniques, thousands of algorithms hundreds of algorithm families and specialized fields. So it's a very complicated space, and you will see exactly how large is this space in the literature in a moment. I want to start by saying that machine learning is not new, and AI is not new, and biomedical machine learning is not new. There is this misconception that AI machine learning came about in the last 15 to 20 years thanks to the efforts of some major private companies. But that's not true. I present for you here two very old and seminal papers. One dated back in 1959 and in Science, and the other one in JAMA in 1961, where they showed very clearly the pioneering authors, the Homer Warner and his colleagues, and Ledley and Lasted correspondingly, that the principles of application of machine learning and various AI decision support were known many, many years ago. What has happened recently, though, is a perfect storm that we will examine in a second. So there are many misconceptions and myths about health AI and machine learning. The first one I addressed, that's novel, emerged only recently. That's not true. The second one is that only very specific areas exist and dominate everything, like deep learning or large language models, chat bots, etc. That's not true either. We saw in the previous slides that there are numerous sub areas that are equally or in many ways more important. Also that AI comes from more of the commercial side and industry. That's a third myth. And also that, that the general requirements of general AI are sufficient for healthcare and health discovery. And that's also not exactly true. Many more misconceptions exist. Let's visit these ones because I think they're very important. So first of all, why the AI that, say, Amazon.com is using in the product recommendation side of things or the customer modeling, they're not sufficient for health AI. Well, health AI is very much driven by clinical objectives, health economics, and the specific structure of healthcare delivery systems and their interactions. And similarly for the system of science. It typically has to do with very high dimensionalities, very small sample sizes. So the sample size in the health space is typically tiny relative to the dimensionalities. The data is very noisy. It's often sampled suboptimally and with non-random designs. For example, the electronic medical record is a primary example of that. Causality is absolutely critical in health AI. And the data types, their diversity and unique characteristics are very important in implementing correctly AI and developing it in the health space. And probably the thing that's, from my end, the most important element that differentiates the health AI and machine learning from generic AI and machine learning is the issue of the sensitivity to accuracy, cost effectiveness, quality control, and safety. So if a Facebook image recognition or a Google image recognition AI model fails and classifies, a school bus as a banana, which is a famous example of errors in the literature of image processing, or if it fails to say, do you want meat with your potatoes, in a shopping cart, that's not a big deal. However, if an AI makes an error about triaging a COVID patient and a patient that needs to be hospitalized or go to the ICU is sent home, that's a life and death decision and life and death error. So it's the biggest difference, I think, is the safety aspect and the need to maximize effectiveness. It's a very well-developed field. I went out to the literature and I identified 9 Turing Award recipients and 8 Nobel Prize recipients whose work is either foundational or implementing and using major AI innovations and discoveries in the last several decades, which shows that AI and machine learning are very mature and very science-driven, well-developed fields. They're not something that's being cooked right now as we speak in some lab somewhere. I spoke previously about the perfect storm. This has to do with the ability to capture massive big data but also the emergence of algorithms that can reliably handle tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, some cases millions of variables. In many cases, well-designed efficient algorithms can tackle these dimensionalities with modest computer requirements and extreme tolerance to low sample sizes without overfitting. And they have guaranteed properties, most of the major AI and machine learning methods. And they can also, some of them, reliably and scalably discover causality without experiments, something that was considered impossible until a few years ago. So all of this creates an environment where the technology of AI can create immense value and benefit to society and health science discovery and healthcare application and the health of people. However, as I will describe, it has also the potential, if designed incorrectly and if it's deployed incorrectly, to create also immense harm. Let's see a little bit what's going on in the literature. So this is a fairly recent search in PubMed where I just retrieved articles that talked about machine learning and outcomes or health services. So this does not cover health science discovery. It's a constrained space, but very tailored to outcomes. So there are more than 6,000 articles in that particular category, and 240 of them were systematic reviews. And as you can see in this slide, they really cover all aspects of healthcare. There's no major area of healthcare and disease populations that's left out. So we see the literature is maturing very much. We're talking about systematic reviews and outcomes. Okay, this is at the end of the value chain, so to speak. This is not preliminary and highly exploratory and curiosity-based research. On the downside, out of 50,000 studies that are listed in PubMed tagged as machine learning or indexed as machine learning studies, only 640 of them, about 1%, 1.2%, they mention causality. And that shows that there is tremendous room for improving this aspect of biomedical and health machine learning. Searching in Google Scholar, one can find 3 million articles mentioning AI and another 3 million articles, partially overlapping these two sets, mentioning machine learning. So it's a huge literature space. It's an incredibly large literature space. In PubMed, the trends of various areas are showing exponential growth in the last about 10 years, both in machine learning and other aspects of AI. The only area that George and I found that is collapsing, actually, in terms of literature growth is the expert systems area, because expert systems are mostly knowledge-driven, whereas decision support that's based on data modeling of the machine learning variety is now overcoming the clinical decision support space. And there are about 90,000 papers mentioning machine learning and about 166,000 papers mentioning AI in PubMed. So what do we need best practices? We need best practices along the spectrum of basic science to translational science to healthcare practice and health science and clinical science, to ensure that the performance of AI models and decision support, the safety and the cost effectiveness are up to par. This is a very, very important element. Now, allow me to visualize some of these aspects with some vivid images. On the left, we see a device that can fly. It's a bicycle that has a wing on top, very famous example of about 100 years ago of how the whole aviation industry started. And on the right side, we see a modern example of an aviation engineering. Clearly, the device on the left can fly. Same for the device on the right. I would not want personally to fly on a bicycle with a wing. And that points to the issue of performance and efficiency and safety. And also, let me point out something that goes to another myth, which is the anthropomorphic expectation from AI. So there are many authors, commentators, and opinion leaders, etc., who say, oh, when AI will be able to think like a human being, then it will be very powerful, and then we will see benefit, etc. And that's absolutely not the case. The human mind has numerous cognitive biases and limitations. There are existing algorithms, methods, and methodologies in AI and machine learning that vastly outperform the human mind in their capabilities of avoiding biases and making inferences on a vast scale. And this notion that unless it looks like human intelligence is not good is absolutely wrong. It's a similar saying that we would like the aviation engineering to be based on machines that flap wings. So modern rockets and jet craft do not have flapping wings, and there's a reason for that. But the effectiveness and the efficiency is much better without flapping wings, without trying to mimic nature necessarily. And another vivid image that I like to share a lot is that of a warning sign and a property. So if you think about bridges, if you think about buildings, about electrical devices, toys, drugs, everything you can imagine, it has a safety and regulatory framework around it that describes when it can be used safely and effectively. And we put things like the sign on the left to say, oh, this bridge cannot withstand weight more than 7.5 tons in this case. And if you try to drive over this bridge, with a heavier object, then you're going to have a tragic accident. And unfortunately, if you think about it, every aspect of modern life and engineering and society and population and facing devices and engineering comes with such warnings and such regulations, except for AI. So, and we'll see more precise examples of this. So we need to equip AI and machine learning with characterizations of their properties and their safety regions and effective and performant regions. So what happens if we do not have such best practice in place? Well, I'll show you a number of things that happen. Number one, there is the hype and disillusionment cycle, also known as a market crash. And Gartner is famous for creating the hype cycle model, where you start with exuberant optimism and unfounded expectations, then there is a sudden drop to disillusionment, then a slower slide up with alignment until the real value is reached. And we have experienced many AI winners in the United States back in the 70s, and also in the United Kingdom and in Japan. And we see again this overhyping, disillusionment, and then struggling to get back to realistic expectations happening again and again. And I would suggest that you read the newest report by Gartner about the hype cycle for emerging technologies in 2023 as very interesting read about various technologies that are on this ascending part of the hype cycle. In recent years, some very famous people, including a Turing Award recipient, opined in 2016 that we should stop training radiologists because deep learning is going to read all the images. And that was extraordinarily too optimistic and unrealistic statement, because the current crop of technology cannot tackle with the clinical aspects of radiological image reading. And this is well understood now in the literature why this cannot happen at this stage, at least. We're not talking about 50 years from now or 20 or 30, we're talking about 2016. Another aspect is heuristic systems. Heuristic systems, one way to understand them is that systems, we don't know their properties very well. So they're applied with some wishful thinking baked in. And in the 70s and the 80s, there was a surge of heuristic systems because that was considered a way to avoid the technical difficulties of creating formal systems with formal properties. Now they have, of course, that was abandoned with the emergence of data-driven machine learning. In the 2000s and onward, we have the re-emergence of heuristic systems, mostly coming from the side of big companies that want to commercialize AI technology, IBM Watson, and chatbots are major examples of this. Now, how can we address this? One way that we have adopted in the work that George Simon and I did is to adopt the drug regulation idea of drug labels. So if you think about drug label, it says in a very, very concise format, what is this drug? What does it contain? What are its main uses? What are adverse events that can happen? Excuse me, warnings. How to take it properly, how to adjust the dosages for, children or older adults, etc. So it provides a very concise description of how this thing can be used effectively and safely. And we adopted this for AI machine learning methods, and we call this the AI machine learning method label. And we have created these short descriptions of proper use, main use, context of use, secondary uses, pitfalls, suggested the areas that the method should not be used, the principle of operation, the theoretical properties, empirical properties, the main literature associated with it, all of this in a very concise format for all methods that are all main methods in AI and machine learning. And we have created a big map that maps all known theoretical properties and empirical performance for all known main methods. The thing to notice is that for heuristic systems, basically it's a series of unknowns. Various theoretical properties are not known, but empirical performance is not known. And once you think about it in those terms, you realize that using systems that do not have well-defined properties is a very big risk, and it's antithetical to the notion of safety and effectiveness that's so important for healthcare and health science. Also, another problem that happens when best practices are not followed is the disconnect between what the machine does and what's needed in actual problem solving in healthcare and health science discovery. We have disconnect of techniques from patient care needs, care workflows, okay, in the system of science. And we have some prime examples in the literature going back to the 70s and 80s of ingenious and very interesting systems that never solved any problem that was an actual problem in actual healthcare, and therefore they were not adopted, although they were very ingeniously devised and validated in some ways in specific tasks. They did not meet actual needs, and therefore they were not. They did not find their way to practice. Another problem that happens when best practices are not followed is hyper focusing on the algorithm. So there is one school of thought was wrong that, oh, this algorithm can solve all problems. We know mathematically that's not possible. It's mathematically proven that no single method can solve all problems. There is another school of thought that says, oh, if you have enough data, the algorithm doesn't matter. That's known also as data hubris, and that's not also correct. And in reality, it's a combination of three things that really leads to success. One is the right definition of the problem. We're tackling, designing the research design, the data collection around that, having the proper algorithm that can analyze this kind of data, and then embedding these algorithms and inputting the data into model selection and error estimation protocols and stacks that use possibly many techniques simultaneously to lead to a successful AI and machine learning model. And so there is this interaction of three elements, data design, algorithm, and model selection and error estimation that's critical to the success. Sometimes people have used, we know this from the literature very well now, there are main examples of either companies or academic groups or quality control consortia that did experiments, and they found out that wonderful algorithms for specific tasks really collapse and they lose their effectiveness if they're put in their own protocol with their own model selection and error estimation. Another problem when best practices are not followed is using non-causal methods for like predictive modeling methods for causality, and I'm going to go into this with more detail in a minute. Also, not having clinical grade models, meaning models that are really designed to offer a level of safety and effectiveness that guarantees clinical utility and acceptance. A major paper came out in 21 out of Oxford, I believe. They analyzed all the literature on all COVID models, AI models. Until that time, they found more than 2,200 studies and models. they had a series of criteria for clinical applicability, and they found that even for just looking at the basic criteria, basic requirements, that no study and no model out of more than 2,200 models met basic criteria for clinical readiness, which is astounding if you think about it. It means that the whole literature about it was just at that. And I know for a fact, and I'm sure you know also, that many commercial and other models were used in clinical practice on actual human beings for life and death decisions at the same time. That's very worrisome. And finally, let me say that there is a whole string of commercial ventures into AI and machine learning that has been underperforming in the last several years because they failed to translate success from non-health problem domains to health domains. So for example, there were companies that said, oh, I have a technology that plays Go very well. It's a world champion in Go, or plays Space Invaders, or excuse me, plays Jeopardy well, etc., etc. But that does not translate necessarily to either health science discovery or healthcare application. And also the whole hype about deep learning that supposedly will solve all problems. It's a great technology for sure and a dominant for image processing. However, when it was tested by more than 300 studies for clinical decision support, it did not outperform vanilla classical logistic regression from the 80s. And also, it was shown that some studies that claimed that it outperformed logistic regression were heavily biased. So more than 300 studies established this this failure. Also, very famous examples using web searches to detect flu trends, incorporating racial bias in AI models, the famous Opto model situation, underperforming sepsis models in the EPIC system, and also the very well discussed and broadly exposed the technical and ethical dangers associated with large language models. Now, this is a very small literature references examining these issues from a purely scientific perspective. And in the book, we have a long chapter about the history of failures and what was learned and how it pushed forward improvement in AI and machine learning. And it also has about 170 references, so it's extremely well referenced, and a very interesting read if we want to improve the state of the art and pursue a science-driven AI and machine learning versus commercial marketing hype and all that. So a very important concept is trust in AI. And this is discussed at different circles throughout society, government, regulatory bodies, and so forth. And there are 7 dimensions of trust. One is scientific and technical trust, that something is well engineered. A health system trust, that machine learning can work successfully within how the healthcare system is operating. The system of science trust, which is the analogous concept for the system of science for discovery. The beneficiary trust, which are, beneficiaries are obviously patients, society, healthcare administrators, and so forth. The delivery and operator trust, meaning working care providers and working scientists. The regulatory trust, which is obviously very important. And finally, the ethical and social trust and acceptance. Okay, so now you might say, this is wonderful, so we need best practices, otherwise bad things happen. And if we have best practices, then we can expect trust and success in terms of effectiveness, cost effectiveness, safety. But where do these best practices come from? And the answer is not a single place. There are many sources. One is, there is a literature about guidelines for AI and machine learning for specific areas. There are quality control consortia that have published very important findings that guide the construction of best practices. There are big benchmark studies, and some of them are very authoritative, and they also tell us what techniques work well under what conditions and what kinds of data and problems, and when not. There are machine learning and AI competitions. Some of them are very well designed. The majority of them probably not. So there are ones that are more educationally oriented and the others that are more science driven. There are also criteria and meta-analytic and systematic reviews that address risk of bias, reporting and certification standards. Regulatory standards have appeared since a year and a half ago in the European Union, the FDA new requirements and standards and recommendations, the NIST and others. Case studies with errors and literature reports that say these are how bad things happen and here's how we can prevent this from happening in the future. And of course, probably the most important is theoretical properties. And theoretical properties are very important because they cover an infinity of situations. So if I run a particular AI or machine learning model in an empirical study in a particular population, et cetera, it works for that particular context. A single theorem that shows a property of the method covers an infinity of situations, and that shows the strength of theoretical properties. Now, I'm not going to go very deeply into describing workflows and best practices for method development, model development. I'm going to say that, I'm going to skip a little bit here. I'm going to say that there are many factors that go into the life cycle of a properly developed and deployed machine learning model. And they cover intentionality, data design, model optimization, regulatory aspects, ancillary benefits, and so forth. And the situation is much more complicated and more difficult when it comes to developing new methods, because we need to start very carefully from defining mathematically the problem we're trying to solve, coming up with algorithms or new or modified ones, proving their properties, testing them under controlled conditions, then testing them in real life eventually, and doing a whole bunch of refinements. And unfortunately, in the literature of many of these new AI, machine learning, and so forth techniques, many of these important steps are being skipped. And therefore, there are gaps in our knowledge and understanding of how this is to be done properly. So, excuse me, I'm skipping through some slides because of time. I also want to emphasize that what about this notion of theoretical properties versus empirical performance? Both are needed. Both are needed because we can have beautiful theories and then they're not used in the right context and practice. The assumptions are not met in certain populations or distributions. And vice versa, we cannot jump the theoretical properties and go into empirical evaluation because we may put human lives at risk. So it's inexcusable, in my opinion, to say, here's a system that we know very little theoretically when it will fail and how, and we will do a clinical trial with human beings, evaluating whether this system works or not. To me, this is inexcusable, because we need first to get a proper theoretical understanding and de-risking of this technology before we risk human subjects using it. Another very important area of success or failure in AI is overfitting, underfitting, and overconfidence. But most people talk about overfitting. You have a very complicated model, does well on a small sample, but does not generalize well. Underfitting is the opposite. You could build a better model and you did not examine all possible model families, or you didn't parameterize their parameters well for good general error. And overconfidence is when we expect a model to do really well and doesn't. And this is a failure of error estimation and data design predominantly, whereas the other two problems are failures of model selection. So let me mention very, very briefly about causality versus prediction. Predictive modeling is used very often for causal tasks, and this is wrong. Why? Because there is a natural distribution of a system of interest. That system could be a healthcare system, it could be a patient or a patient population, whatever is of interest. And predictive modeling works well for prediction and forecasting without intervention, meaning where the system of interest functions as usual. If we want to do interventions, of preventative nature, of therapeutic nature, or any other manipulation and intervention to change the system, we need causal modeling. And predictive modeling cannot substitute causal modeling, produces many false positive and false negative errors. A classic example in that aspect is length of stay. Many hospitals around the country for years and years try to minimize length of stay. Why? Because predictably, smaller length of stay was associated and predictive of better clinical outcomes, better reimbursement, better operating profits. But if you look at the causal structure of how length of stay is involved in all of this, is completely confounded most of the time. And therefore, if you manipulate the length of stay, you cannot ensure better clinical outcomes, better reimbursement, better operating profits, and so forth, so on. Same thing happens in other domains. I don't have time to go into that. The thing I want to say, though, is that we have formal causal discovery methods that can now, AI machine learning methods that can learn reliably causality at a grand scale under broad assumptions, and they can overcome this notion of the 60s and the 50s that correlation is not causation. Unless you do experiments, you'll never learn causality. That's not true anymore. There are several Turing Award and AI and Nobel Prize winners whose work laid the theoretical foundations for reliable discovery of causality with modern causal algorithms without experiments. And there are specific assumptions that underlie these things. The assumptions are very broad. And they're broader than the typical assumptions, for example, that classical statistics operates under. And causal models really allow us to connect predictivity and causality in very formal ways, to find the direct causes, indirect causes, confounded variables, so-called passengers in biology, to also find the smallest set of variables that have maximum predictive performance and maximum causal ability to influence a response or several responses of interest. So we can blend now. We have the tools to blend causal and predictive modeling really well. But if someone is using heuristic epidemiological criteria like Hill's criteria or predictive modeling techniques that are super good for and successful for predictive modeling, or principal components analysis of gene lists or clustering, correlation networks, etc., these do not produce good causal results, either from the perspective of causal structure or from the perspective of causal effect estimates. And moreover, let me mention that if someone says, oh, we are going to do randomized experiments in clinical trials only, there are several proofs now, mathematical, that show that you cannot learn a complex causal system by doing one randomized clinical experiment at a time. It's not mathematically possible. So clinical trials are great confirmatory tools, but they're not great discovery tools and complex causality modeling tools. And finally, let me say, before I go to applications, that equivalence classes are also a big problem, because when we analyze data and we come up with a model, typically there are up to an exponential number of models, exponential to the number of variables, that have equal optimality characteristics in terms of predictivity and compactness, parsimony. And the same is true for local causal models of the response variable of interest. Therefore, just picking one out of these and presenting it as an answer omits a huge universe of alternatives that may have completely different characteristics, and some of them will not, may contain the true causes that what we chose and presented does not have. So having said all of that, and I'm omitting a huge space of other aspects of best practices and so forth by necessity, in recent years, we were very fortunate to participate, my lab, my collaborators, with groups from Duke University and also University of Minnesota, and pursue some aging and longevity science research that, in my opinion, is extremely interesting and groundbreaking in some respects. And they have to do with various hallmarks of aging, be that may genomic instability, epigenetics, cellular senescence, and their interactions. So this is a case study here, a recently published paper where we built predictive models, found biomarkers and interventions using conventionally available clinical molecular data out of a cohort with 1,500 participants over 27 years. It's the DAP study by Duke. And we were able to build models that are predicted to identify biomarkers and possible interventions. And that was up to the best known standard at the time, which is clinically significant, with AUCs of about 76 for 2 year and 5 year, and 66 much lower for 10-year longevity. And we applied, in doing these kinds of modeling, many of the principles that I mentioned previously: good data design, differentiated the predictive from the causal modeling, fully modeling the equivalence classes, and coming up with markers that we have robust estimates of causal effects, either for advancing or hampering longevity, to create a panel of clinically available, easy to obtain and to deploy in clinical practice markers and interventions, which are summarized in this plot. In very recent research, which we haven't published yet, we added small RNAs and found an incredible result. We can now predict 2-year mortality with a 0.92 AUC, which is completely unprecedented in aging research, and also estimate causal effects of the type of doubling the expected survival in a 2-year frame if all of these microRNAs are being simultaneously targeted by drugs. We also did some very interesting research examining extracellular vesicles in aging-related disease and longevity. So we have one article that's published, one that was accepted for publication, one that's forthcoming, where we saw that, first of all, extracellular vesicles in knee osteoarthritis, they play a major role. They're highly differentiated between plasma and synovial fluid, and their point of origin is the innate immune system. And I don't have the time, unfortunately, to go into the details of how this is established and the kinds of analytics that go into producing these kinds of results. This is just a showcase of what's possible. And of course, there are references there that you can see the details of. In a forthcoming manuscript, we examine the ability to use extracellular vesicles to predict and possibly affect human longevity, and there the predicted the signal is just immense. It's like basically 0.99 AUC, 1 AUC, depending on whether it's discovery or validation data set. It's an incredibly strong signal about the role of extracellular vesicles, again, having to do with the immune system. And finally, as the third and final area of research that I want to mention, and I apologize, but because we're running rapidly out of time, is cellular senescence, which cellular senescence is when cells stop dividing, basically, and it is related to aging phenotypes and aging diseases and development and other processes. And cellular senescence is being there are many markers known or putative markers that have to do with DNA damage response and CDK inhibitors and the secretory phenotype. And some of them are genetic, some of them are transcriptomic, some of them are proteomic, and so forth. And there is a very big initiative in the NIH called the CENET, which is a consortium of universities and awardees that are studying cellular senescence, and they work to establish an atlas of cellular senescence in humans and the mouse. And this is the University of Minnesota has 2 of those grants: the Healthy Human Tissue Mapping grant and the Murine grant, which is a collaboration with Mayo. And part of this is to collect tissues and data sets with a variety of omics platforms, from liver and fat tissue in the University of Minnesota. Other centers are doing other tissues. Put this in comprehensive warehouses, annotate them thoroughly, upload them to the data coordinating center, and then analyzing this data with a specific effort to create a model of the causal axis of cellular senescence. And the causal axis means that there are perturbations and triggers of senescence and diseases that lead to the emergence of senescence, and molecular pathways are basically involved in how we get to irreversible cell division. And then we have other disease and other outcomes that are the end result of this process. And of course, this whole process starts with some very descriptive analysis coming out of the assays. But the most important element is to apply causal AI there to uncover this axis or causality of cellular senescence. And we leverage a lot of properties of existing techniques for pathway reverse engineering, causal modeling, predictive biomarker optimization, equivalence class modeling, etc. But there are many problems, and proper method development here dictates that before applying these techniques, we need to make sure that our data is correct, the data design is correct, and the algorithms are modified. So here I'm showing some tests on the data to establish whether senescence seems to be a diffusion or a random process. Diffusion means it starts from somewhere and then there's signaling and spreads out spatiotemporally. And a random process means that it spontaneously happens all over the tissue. This analysis using something called Moran's I's value shows that it is a diffusion process in our data. Then examining whether fundamental assumptions of causal inference for causal AI hold, and causal Markov condition is the most important assumption. And this is a test that shows that indeed the causal Markov condition holds in this data. And then assay quality control, because the omics platforms we use have a variety of artifacts, edge artifacts, holding artifacts, and others, and these need detection and correction. And then we need to address the issue of random selection. What's statistically significant different than random, and what's the meaning of that? And then modifying the existing causal algorithms to adapt them to the specific problem. And here we adapt an existing class of algorithms called the generalized local learning, or GLL, to the assumption that we have spatial invariance of the process, both in terms of location and orientation of the causal process, so that we can basically learn locally causally invariant models. And the result of all of this is that we were able to identify causal hubs and modulators of cellular senescence. So in conclusion, I'm advocating here and presenting a vision essentially for the health AI of the near future, hopefully very near future, which is driven by health value. It's embedded in real life problem solving. It's deployed at scale. It doesn't fight the human workforce, but elevates the science and the health practice with the human in the loop. It helps us eventually to reimagine how various scientific or healthcare specialties are being done. It drives important trends and developments in medicine, like aging research and healthy aging being a primary example. And essentially leads us to have a healthcare and health science that's trustworthy. Trustworthy, why? Because it's intentional, effective, safe, efficient, science-driven, de-risked, and accountable at the end of the day. I want to say there are numerous aspects in best practices we did not discuss. Hopefully, when the book comes out very, very soon, you will be able, if you're interested, to download it and look at more details. I would welcome and value your feedback once you do so. I want to acknowledge our wonderful collaborators in Duke, led by Virginia Krause and Bill Krause, their labs, corresponding labs for longevity and metabolic outcomes. Laura Ninderhofer and colleagues in the University of Minnesota Cellular Senescence Tissue Mapping Centers. The University of Minnesota Informatics team, special thanks go with regards to their contributions to the research presented here to Eric Kammerfeld, Cici Ma, Jinsua Wang, Steve Johnson, and our wonderful IHI data scientist group members, who are too numerous to list here, but they are all referenced in the papers I provided. And we're very grateful for the 3 grants listed here that support the aging research I mentioned, and several more grants in the past that are no more active, but these are the active ones. I provided some references here for selected methods and some references for selected applications. And I would welcome any feedback and questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aliferis, for this really great presentation. I think it was very comprehensive and it captured the vision for AI, for aging, for all of us. I want to remind our attendees that you can post your questions for Dr. Aliferis in the Q&A box. And while folks are doing that, maybe I'll start first. You already talked about the need for AI to be de-risked, maybe more transparent and safe. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts, especially in the context of the recent executive order by President Biden, about what entities, if any, should be controlling AI tools when they're designed for healthcare purposes.
Controlling is more of an implementation issue. I think that we need to think a lot about who are the constituents, whose needs we try to serve as scientists and technologists, and you know, in the case of President Biden as political leaders and so forth. And I think that AI is a universally applicable technology and science. It can really cover all aspects of human nature and human aspirations. And as such, the constituents are numerous, and at the end, they encompass all of society. So the most important thing for me is for all of society, it has the opportunity to express its needs, its aspirations, its red lines, its fears, when it comes to the design and development and deployment of AI technology. And I listed in the presentation several such constituents. For example, healthcare systems, patients, advocacy groups, regulators, ethical and you know, social justice advocates and other groups. I think that what the European Union has done is with the AI Act is really a good model for framing this properly. So they have addressed all aspects of AI implications, going from data privacy to job security to affecting you know, human life by affecting the economy, etc. So it was completely end-to-end treatment, and they gave themselves several years to accept input from all constituents. And only very recently, after 3 years of deliberations, we have a final draft framework which is expected to be ratified soon in the European Union, and it's extremely broad and well thought out. So I think we need something similar in our country, maybe better, but similar in its scope. And there are some beginning steps. For example, the FDA has made some good steps by new regulation about medical AI devices, and some machine learning best practices, or good practices, they call it, and it's just 10 practices. And NIST also has made some recommendations for voluntary adoption by technology companies and so forth. I think we need more. And I think that everybody who is affected or will be affected by this technology and science has to be able to provide input and to be protected, and their interests to be served. And I'm sorry, I understand it's a very broad answer. It's extremely broad, but it's not trying to avoid to be specific, but rather to emphasize that all of society is affected, all of society should participate and have a say in this, in my opinion.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask, in terms of the role of the clinicians, you already mentioned that the fear that AI would replace radiologists didn't prove to be true. And we now see more and more that when people are predicting that professions will go away, that may not necessarily be the case. But obviously, as you pointed out, this will affect how we do things, and maybe we redefine or expand roles. I'm wondering, do you see for clinicians in the near future needing maybe changes in medical education, or what are your thoughts about how they can effectively embrace AI in their daily work?
So first to clarify, I firmly believe that AI, image processing, will replace maybe 90% of working imaging specialists and radiologists, maybe 20 years from now, or some horizon like that. Certainly not in 5 years. And maybe the role of the imaging specialists of the future will be to create better technology that's really more effective, more accurate, more efficient, and so forth. Or for a small number of individuals to be in the humans in the loop of the critical care decisions. So this is true also for many other specialists, I believe, and scientific working scientists. Because I think that a lot of what happens here in discovery, which is a highly distributed system, the system of science is highly distributed, with the exception of some, big initiatives like, the Human Genome Project or other species genome projects, etc. But these are the minority and the exception. The majority is distributed system. And I believe that algorithmic discovery can do a much better job, faster, better, and so on. So many, many, many people or roles will not be relevant anymore in a very short time frame. And I believe that both the scientific training programs and the healthcare workforce training programs and educational programs should be AI proof and should accommodate very thoughtful and deliberate measures to ensure that their graduates will be able to withstand the wholesale intrusion and replacement that mechanized intelligence and robotic production and all of that will bring to the healthcare professions and the health sciences. Otherwise, we may encounter an incredible crisis because many, many people may find themselves either not relevant anymore or financially non-viable because a machine can do their job 10 times faster at 10 times less cost. So we need, as educators and as systems of education, universities and others, to think how we will protect the workforce of the future and how we will avoid a huge societal disruption that may happen when machine-enabled or replaced production becomes the norm.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we're running against the time, and several people had commented during your talk about whether they can see a recording later on, and we will have a recording of Dr. Aliferis' presentation on our YouTube channel in a few days, and you'll be receiving an email for those who registered to be able to access it. Our next webinar is on Thursday, December 7th at noon with Dr. Ab Brody from NYU talking about equitably developing and implementing technologies with persons living with dementia and their caregivers to improve care and provide support. Dr. Aliferis, thank you again so much for joining us today for this great presentation. And I hope to see you all. Thank you all for attending and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.